I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start. This episode is going to discuss hate crimes and police brutality. If that's not something you feel like you can listen to right now, I won't blame you if you skip this episode. Hello, my name is Amber and welcome to You Look Like a Badger, a monthly podcast where I discuss queer cinema. It is November and the genre that I'm discussing this month are queer mystery films. I've titled this month, I Bet You Can't Find Me. The film that I'm going to be discussing is Young Soul Rebels.
But I'll tell you something, an hour of soul a week is an hour too much for some. We got these patriotic listeners out there, and they always ring.
But your show is doing well.
It's doing great. That's what they can't handle. But let me ask you something. Do you play your music for yourself, to party, or for listeners?
I didn't say it first, but me and my mate Kaz, we don't just do a club. We run a station ourselves.
Okay, you're serious.
Set in 1977, during the Queen's Silver Jubilee, Young Soul Rebels is a mystery drama film directed by Isaac Julian, surrounding the murder of a gay black man and two pirate DJs who try and solve the crime whilst trying to cope with Britain in ideological crisis. Managing to capture the hectic diversity of culture in the 70s, the film refuses simple narratives about race and sexuality, presenting the friendship between the two main characters as both funny and sincere. It's also a stark reminder of the way race has continuously failed to be discussed in a meaningful way within British culture. This film received the Critics' Prize at the 1991 Cannes Film Festival. On Rotten Tomatoes, it does not have a critics score at all, which is a first for this podcast, but it does have an audience score of 52%, and on Letterboxd it has a 3.6. Kind of middling reception. But let's read some of the reviews that I found from Letterboxd. So this first one is from user Liz. Kind of wild to see a movie that actively calls out how openly sexist, racist and homophobic the first wave punk scene really was. That the soundtrack is so killer is the icing on top. I have managed to discuss punk quite a few times on this podcast, which I wasn't expecting. This film and the other example, which was Jubilee, they both had a lot to say about the intricacies of punk and the ways that it really maybe wasn't as radical as first suggested. Something to take into account. This next user is called Pate Duncan, and they say, Spike Lee meets Greg Araki with a British setting and soul soundtrack. It's too endearing to fault too much. Now I picked this one because I kind of disagree, mainly because this film doesn't feel like a Spike Lee film or a Greg Araki film, and I kind of feel like this user picked those examples because they were popular. Because I didn't get that vibe at all, really. This film is like very distinctly British. It feels very homegrown. Both Spike Lee and Greg Araki have very bombastic and intrusive visual styles and editing styles in their films, whereas this one's kind of restrained. I don't know if this user maybe picked these two directors because of identity purposes. And this last one is by user Yanni, and they say, all of those skinheads should have died. That's just my preference, my opinion, my directorial choice. The history of skinheads is like way too complicated to get into in this podcast. And also it wouldn't really be that relevant to this film. They do appear and they are interesting, and I probably will discuss them. This film has a very cut and dry opinion of that kind of subculture, which I do agree with. That is the end of the spoiler-free section. From this point onwards, I will be spoiling the film, so if you haven't seen it and you don't want the film spoiled for you, I would recommend pausing this episode, going away and watching the film, and then coming back and listening to me do some thoughtful analysis. Okay?
Nice choice of music. If a bit obscure. But you come over well. It's just that it's a bit, how shall I say, casual? I mean, not everybody would understand what you're trying to convey. I like it, but the powers that be. Listen, Chris, to be honest with you, if we were to take you on as a presenter, out and about in the clubs, if we were, and that's a big if, we'd be looking for a more recognizable style. Something a bit more,
English?
Yes. Well, I wouldn't put it quite like that, but,
How about this? Right about now, I'm bringing a man called Fat Man saying, you can't keep we down cause we all around. Step forward, the youth. Come let me tell you the truth. That do ya?
So I thought where I'd start is I'd discuss music, which might be a bad idea because I don't feel that knowledgeable. But in terms of like film analysis and the way this film represents music, I want to discuss it in relation to British identity, because the 70s was a very politically fraught time, and whenever there is that kind of rupture in normality, a lot of like subcultures pop up to create transgressive art against the system, against the man. And there were lots of different types of music going on that were like created and then solidified during this time. What this film does is it sets it within the context of pirate radio, which is where people would set up unofficial radio stations that you could access by just like turning the dial and accidentally finding it. And you know, this is made a lot easier by having like a portable system to listen to music on. One of the first things that we see in the film is a stereo, like a boombox, that TJ, the man who is murdered in the beginning of the film, is carrying around, and he's listening to the Soul Patrol, the Soul Station. This is a film that's very interested in the various parts of Black identity and the way that manifests in pop culture and British culture. So not that those are like separate things, but the way that they are enmeshed and brought together. So we have this character who is able to freely walk around with this machine, this stereo, and listen to music that he likes, that he feels represented by. When he's murdered, it's really significant that the killer steals his stereo, that his murder is recorded on tape, that the stereo is burnt, that this stereo is like used as a way to frame Chris, because it really is like symbolic of the ways that Black British people cultivate culture for themselves, and then the ways that that's usurped, destroyed, and turned against them. I'm aware that I started off pretty heavy, but the film sets up the racial aspect of music pretty early on, and then it's explored throughout, so I don't think I'm like out of place pointing that out. And all of this is happening on the backdrop of the Silver Jubilee. It's like the main background event of the film. Like we see a giant silver crown in the radio station, and there's a cutout of the Queen waving her hand. We got pop culture, the main culture that's meant to be respected, like the people who are very royalist and who are celebrating the Jubilee. And then we've got subculture, which manifests in the Soul Patrol radio station and the Fuck the Jubilee concert. The film sets up main culture being at odds with subculture, but then the subcultures being at odds with one another as well. This has a lot to do with race. So in an interview with Isaac Julian that I found, he says the following: "There are new barriers being put up symbolically and psychically around national identity, racial identity, nationality, and citizenship. All this brings up a number of anxieties for people like myself who are Black and born here in Europe, the new Europe." So in relation to music, the film points at the racial lines between punk and soul, with the former being very white and the latter being created by Black people. The film shows that the ways that these subcultures are at odds, but it also shows the ways that they very regularly interact with one another. So there's a scene where Chris and Kaz are DJing a club, and we see there's just a load of punks there as well. So we got the soul fans and the punks, and they're all in the same club and they're all like dancing. It's also kind of a gay club as well. So both of these subcultures have probably more in common than they have different. And the things they have in common include anti-nationalism, anti-fascism, queer acceptance for the most part, and a love of music. The film wants to emphasize that punk is distinctly British, but soul is also distinctly British, and the fact that soul is coming from black people doesn't make it not British. The difference, really, is that in order to get mainstream appeal, it's a lot harder for Chris and Kaz to get on the air, and that they're explicitly told that they have to conform if they want to have mainstream appeal, which is true of really any kind of subculture. There is like a flattening out of all radical ideas, but it is interesting the way that the main characters interact with people who have gotten into the business, and they're kind of told like, yeah, you're gonna need to strip everything that makes this cool and interesting in order to actually get played, in order to appeal to most likely a white audience, and that soul isn't popular with audiences, and that it truly is niche, and that means that they probably can't ever pursue a career as a DJ, as a radio host, without stripping away what makes them interesting. And that really does fit very nicely into the ways that Black British people are and aren't considered British, and what parts of them are seen as acceptable. You know, I'm from the UK and I find British culture really creepy and weird, especially, you know, the lines which are drawn of what is and is not British. Apparently, to select groups, anyone who isn't white and straight and able-bodied. My country is a nightmare, I'm sorry. The film kind of emphasizes that xenophobia is honestly a huge part of British identity. And it doesn't like sugarcoat or lie about it. That just truly is what the deal is. The way that the two main characters kind of diverge from the royalist hegemonic view of Britain maybe suggests that if conformity is the only way to get the success that they want, that they don't want to be British in the way that would be acceptable. If you have to be watered down and you have to like remove all of the parts of you that are interesting and that make you happy, that remind you of your difference rather than the ways that you conform, then maybe you can't ever be truly British to bigots, and that maybe you wouldn't ever want to be. So I have this quote from Film Days about the film, and it says this: "The combination of queer, black and punk aesthetics in Young Soul Rebel goes against the language of colonialism, weakening British standards as well as defying the heightened nationalism of the environment." And honestly, what isn't more British than unquestioned patriotism? I think the representation of diversity in music, it might be more hopeful than I'm making it sound, because I've been pretty dour immediately, but this film has very distinct moments of joy, and music is a huge part of that. The film is trying to celebrate the diversity of Britain whilst also fully acknowledging for a lot of people, that diversity is a threat, and music is really just a conduit for that. That nationalism and bigotry kind of go hand in hand, and that for marginalised people, patriotism isn't a neutral thing.
Pick your places, didn't you? You heard what happened?
Yeah, I heard.
Oh, you like living dangerously.
I just want to show the bastards I ain't stopping coming here.
Not to continue on with very heavy themes, but let's talk about fascism. Oh God. Okay. So I think it's really interesting because the film sets up like a lot of radical ideas. So we have these two main characters, Kaz and Chris, and they exist in these subcultures. They almost feel like outside of culture, or at least a culture that's recognizable to a mainstream British audience. So they hang out in pirate radio stations, and they smoke weed in Chris's bedroom, and they hang out in the barber shop this is not a film that has cast two black leads and just intends to just like plug them into any kind of British story. It's a film that is specifically about black British men. So they exist in the spaces that are for them, and one of those happens to be a barbershop. And in that barbershop, there are like paintings on the wall of Muhammad Ali and Luther King. Already we have two iconic black figures who were involved in radical movements about race in America. This is in contrast to the UK, which has incredibly meager discussions about race. In fact, even today, it does feel like it's not even a problem. Those images in the barbershop, they feel almost aspirational. Like, these radical conversations about race are confined to a space that only really black people would enter. So they don't exist outside of that at all. Meanwhile, the National Front and skinheads, they exist in public and are very much not challenged. I wouldn't argue that they're mainstream, but they were popular enough that even now we know what they are, what they mean, and what they stood for. Fascism. And, you know, even if they are still subcultures, they had enough of an impact and did enough damage that they feel like a staple of British culture. I would hope that that's not what Britain represents, but I fear I may be wrong. But, you know, we see the National Front graffiti and we see swastikas on the side of the road, which is vastly different to the way where the black people in the film have to, they get like a space for themselves, and it doesn't really leave that space. So the Soul Patrol, they do the pirate radio, and that doesn't have mainstream appeal. And the barbershop is like confined. Another space that we have is like the mechanic, which white people do come into, but it's only to buy weed. So the racial lines are set up, and the feeling of rising fascism is just throughout the film. So we have the character of Sparky, who apparently went to school with Kaz and Chris. He's a skinhead, and apparently he used to be into soul music and isn't anymore, and now hangs out with racists. This might feel like a really obvious thing to say, but fascism and nationalism in Britain exists as a really safe haven for white men. And there are people in the film, the killer included, who initially is seen as like normal and kind of okay, but I think a main red flag is he hangs out with the skinheads and he doesn't challenge them, and he doesn't defend Kaz or Chris either, which, you know, should be a sign. Whilst they don't perpetrate this crime, the murder of TJ and the setting up of Chris as the murderer, it is quite implied that they have done other hate crimes. There was a mention of someone's sister getting attacked in the park. It's not even a background of fascism. It's the main, it's kind of the main antagonist of the film. That whilst these two characters are trying to live their lives, they're also trying to fend off the racists from trying to kill them. I don't think I could talk about fascism without really talking about the police. There's a heavy police presence throughout the film, and instead of, I don't know, targeting Nazis or the National Front, or maybe considering why a black man was murdered, they instead do a bunch of racial profiling, intimidate a lot of the characters in the film, and eventually bring Chris in for questioning and accuse him of murder and destroying evidence. White nationalism is very popular, and that it would be more likely that they would have committed this crime. When you live in a country with a majority white population, and you also grow up in a country with the legacy of the empire, you get a lot of just residual racism that doesn't get checked. And because the police are tools of the state, they can then reinforce what is perceived as normal by profiling black men in particular as inherently criminal, and can, as a result, aid fascism by doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the white nationalists, assisting the white nationalists specifically by not challenging them. Why was the National Front allowed to get as popular as it did? The police were there. Why didn't they do anything? So I'm going to read a quote from that Film Days article that I referenced earlier. It says this: "There is often this idea that racism in the UK is simply not as bad, as if the lived experiences of black and brown people can be debated and questioned. Young Soul Rebels is violently aware of how even in polite and cordial England, black men still have a target on their back. The characters are continuously reminded of how little their lives matter under the law, as Kaz is plainly weighed down by his friend's death, and Chris is interrogated by police for this murder that he didn't commit." Fascism really needs patriotism, and it needs this totalizing conformity. And the way that it gets this is through the police and through state violence, but also just an unwillingness to question the systems that are in place. So as things become more fraught, if you're unwilling to see the ways in which the power structures are being used against you or against people you know, then fascism flourishes. It clings to subcultures because it's a lot easier to convince people who already feel forgotten to join their side because they can offer empowerment. And this empowerment comes at the violence of marginalized groups. So if you, as a white person, feel without importance, without power, you feel forgotten by the system, then you can always turn yourself towards bigotry, towards racism more specifically in the context of this film, because that's a place where you will always be powerful. This film recognizes that.
I know it ain't right. I keep thinking it could have been me, you know? How'd you know I was wearing that bit of park?
Why else would TJ be in the park, for fuck's sake?
I didn't mean it like that, Kaz. Christ, I'm him as well, you know? I ain't having it, Chris. It ain't real. Not TJ.
I haven't actually talked about anything gay yet, so I should probably do that. This film, like I said, is very big on subcultures and being unique in the way it represents identity, and referring back to things where if you're part of the gay community then you know that exists, and if you're not then you don't have that knowledge. For example, you might not know what cruising is, and you might not know the significance of it amongst gay men, but if you're a gay man, you recognize that opening scene. Oh, he's in the park because he's trying to he's trying to meet somebody to have a nice time. In that interview that I referenced earlier with Isaac Julian, he says this in relation to the space of the park in the opening of the film. The park is interesting as a symbolic space because it has a dual function. In the daytime, it's the site of family pleasures, heterosexual pleasures, and at night, it's a space that takes on a different excitement. The characters who go there, TJ and Ken, aren't out. I imagine these characters as people who would have sex and then turn back to their respective communities, not out at all. So, although this is a film that explores radical politics, it very much is aware of the ways that queer expression is still closeted and not for the eyes of the people during the day. And it's also aware of the ways that queerness is punished, particularly in black men. The film centres on the homophobic murder of a black man by a white man and how almost sexualised it is. It's really weird to describe this, but initially it obviously looks as if Ken and TJ are gonna like have sex, so they're being very touchy-feely with one another, and it's almost erotic, and then it turns into murder. I'm not a gay black man, so I obviously I can't speak from this experience. This film is kind of interested in mixed race couples, so there's TJ and Ken, but there's also Kaz and Billy Budd. The film wants to explore those boundaries, and specifically in relation to TJ, the ways that black men are kind of fetishized and then hated for the role they have in the gay community. TJ has to be erased by Ken because of his own shame, and TJ suffers because of this. He's murdered. And there's this like looming hazard of the effects that a white partner can have on a person of colour. It's not as simple as it would be if they were the same race, because of those dynamics already discussed earlier, and like the rising fascism as well. During this time, and probably still true today, it's not as simple as simply being together. If it is going to be a relationship of equals, the way that black people are fetishized has to be acknowledged. It is really surprising to have a straight man and a gay man be friends and then have them be the main characters of a film. It's like a straight gay solidarity, but it's very clear that Chris and Kaz have grown up together and that they know each other really well. They have like banter going on, and they're very close. You know, they hang out in each other's rooms. They run a radio show together. They like sort out each other's clothes when they look messy. There's this really nice moment where, as they're leaving the flat, Chris offers Kaz a hug, and they just like hug for a second, because TJ's death really affects Kaz, because in the back of his head he's just thinking, wow, that could have been me, and that really does affect him. And they don't like talk about it in like a super serious way, but they do hug, and you know, they're shown to be there for each other, and in a way that I've not really seen before. Chris is just like very comfortable around queerness. He's really okay with being around queer people. He's not like a straight man who's like, oh, don't flirt with me, please. Like, he hangs out in the gay clubs and he wears a very tight leather pants, and he defends Kaz. You know, he's very close with his friend, so he's very comfortable within himself. And I would also argue that Kaz is as well. We don't see him being like deeply insecure about himself. He seems like perfectly fine with being gay. A lot of the conflict with his character is him simply reacting to the bigotry he's experiencing, which is, I think, is true for both of the characters. Kaz's expression of queerness feels like very effortless. His only like hostility is from those who are openly bigoted to his face, which includes his own brother, who he kind of calls out that Kaz's brother wouldn't be as passionate about TJ's death had the fact that he was gay been more emphasized. There's a lot of like discussion about race, but when Kaz brings up his sexuality, his brother's kind of stumped. He doesn't have like a cogent response to that. So Kaz is like very self-assured. The conflict in the film is not about Kaz's sexuality. It's not about coming out or trying to come to terms with his sexuality. It's simply trying to exist in a world that hates you for multiple reasons. And also, you know, trying to find love and express desire in that world, and how difficult that can be. You know, we see the contrast between Chris's like romantic excursions and Kaz's. Chris pursues Tracy from the radio station, and, you know, they have sex on the roof and they make a tape together. It's all very nice, and they can talk in public and it wouldn't be seen as strange. Whereas Kaz, he returns to the park, which unfortunately not only has become a place of like bigotry and murder, there's now a heavy police presence in the park, which makes it unsafe for gay people to meet up with one another. I mean, Ken is shitty for many reasons, but the main one being that his own shame around his sexuality like ripples out and affects so many people outside of himself. Kaz attempts to have sex with Billy Budd in the park, but he realizes that he's a lot more cautious now, that he's a lot more afraid of what might happen to him, and that this murder has really emphasized the consequences of existing as a black gay man in Britain. That doesn't mean that he is celibate or that he wants to be celibate. He does pursue Billabud. He writes his number in pen on his chest, and they very specifically have sex with one another on the day of the Queen's Jubilee. Instead of attending a street party, they go to Kaz's room and they have some sex. And honestly, much more preferable than hanging out on the street with my neighbours. I would rate gay sex over the Queen's Jubilee. If they were put up against each other, it'd be no contest whatsoever. Although the film, I would argue, has a firmer grasp on its racial politics, it doesn't forget about queerness. And it does try to blend it in very seamlessly. And whilst I think I would like Kaz to be more of an active character, I think a lot of his conflict is internal. And his happy ending involves him pursuing joy and pleasure. And I think it's a really good way of exploring queerness on screen. I think it's just, in spite of everything, there is always queerness and there is always joy to be found there. And I think that's really nice. Does the film look like a badger? I don't think so. I think this is a really good film. I think it's very underrated. I think it should have more eyes on it. Like I said, there isn't even a critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, so there haven't been enough people like formally talking about it. I think it should at least be as popular as Derek Jarman's films, who are seen as like quintessentially British. I think I would have preferred it be more gay. I think whilst Chris as a character is fun, I think I would have enjoyed more of Kaz. I don't know if Isaac Julian was trying to reach a wider audience, maybe by prioritizing the straight counterpart. My personal preference is more gay. I do think it could have been like a smidge shorter. I'm not someone who is like, every film has to be 90 minutes or I'll shoot myself in the face. I think it just could have been more streamlined, a little more focused. Recommendations. I am going to recommend the film Pride, which is a biopic set in the 80s. There is a very large chance that you've already seen it. It's set in the 80s and it's specifically about the solidarity between the gay liberation movement in England and the miners' strike in Wales, and the solidarity between those two groups and the way they come together to fight for one another's rights. I would also recommend the Small Axe series, which was released in 2020, I think. Oh my god, I can't even remember. It was released a couple of years ago, and it basically explores the different facets of Black Britain in the past. I'm going to recommend Alex Wheatle from this series, mainly because I think it's one of the more underrated ones. So it's based on the true story of Alex Wheatle's life, and I think it works with this film because it also emphasizes the role of music in Black British people's existence, and it's a very like subtly political film as well. So it discusses like his time in prison and his life as a writer. I think it's really interesting, and I don't think that one was as well liked as some of the other ones. I quite enjoyed it, so I'll recommend that one. I would like to thank you for listening to this episode. I'm gonna do my last episode of the year in December, and the theme will be Happy Holidays, where I will discuss queer holiday movies. If you would like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter @LikeABadgePod and on Spotify, and subscribe to me on YouTube. If you want to read more of my work, I am really hoping to have a piece up by the end of this month at ambercanwalk.com. If you'd like to give me money, then you can donate to my Kofi, which I'll put in the show notes. All of my sources are also in the show notes in case you wanted to read some more. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in December. Bye!